दे रखा है ना वो आईडी। हाँ जी मैम।
A very good afternoon to you all. Dear participants, welcome back. We are extremely delighted to have with us Dr. Divya Ved. She is an associate professor of sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has an MSc and a DPhil from Oxford. She has held postdoctoral positions at the Department of Sociology and at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi. Her research interests include the study of social mobility and inequalities, educational attainment, work, economy, and the labor market, gender inequalities, class, and political participation, with an interest in application of quantitative and mixed methods. Her work has appeared in several reputed journals. She has authored the book Uneven Odds, Social Mobility in Contemporary India, and has co-edited a volume on marginalities and mobilities among Indian Muslims. Over to you, Dr. Ved.
Thank you. Am I audible? Because someone just mentioned that you were not entirely audible. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
All right. Thank you. Great. So I'm going to start. Thanks for having me. Can I share my screen? Can you give me the rights to share my slides?
Yes, ma'am, I'm doing that. Please give me a moment.
Yeah, sure. So while you do that, I'll just begin anyway. So today I've been asked to speak about mixed methods approaches. And I know that the overall workshop is really on qualitative approaches and qualitative methods. And you've had a series of lectures about the same. I'll be speaking about how one can mix across different methods. And of course, mixed methods are something which, I mean, they've gained much traction more recently, but they've been ways in which researchers, sociologists particularly, have been looking at their material, their field, and their data. So I'll talk about mixing methods, which is putting together both qualitative and quantitative methods. Sorry. Okay, I think I can share my screen now. Let me just see if I can do that. Is that visible to everyone, the screen? Can you just one person tell me if it's visible?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Yes. All right, thank you so much. Okay, so let me start. So when we think about mixing methods, I mean, one of the reasons for why we would think about more than one method is that they would bring together the advantages of, you know, a variety of methods. However, mixing methods is much more than mixing data, right? So if one said that, oh, I have you know, data from this source and I have data from another source, is it the same as mixing methods? It is at a very basic level, but it isn't how we think about mixed methods as an approach in terms of doing research and doing designing the research project. In that, the main purpose really is to think about integrating research. How are the data from the two sources, the qualitative and the quantitative, actually being integrated together? And that is really the main concern of mixed methods approaches. Now, as with any other method, and as you have been having discussions on qualitative methods, with any other method, we have to think through the idea of research design very much in the beginning, and we have to discuss our data collection strategies. And as I'll mention today, there are, of course, different ways to approach mixed methods, and especially different ways in which qualitative research methods may be embedded within the mixed methods approach. For any research, though, any research design requires that we begin with a research question, not the other way around. We don't usually start by saying, I'm a qualitative researcher, and so I'll only use qualitative research methods. What that does is it limits the kinds of methods that we might be able to use. So instead, to begin by anchoring ourselves into the research question itself, and what the research question determines is much more useful. Now, there's a classic book by Creswell and Creswell. I'll share the name of it on the last slide. And I'll draw quite heavily from the book to talk about the kind of stages of mixed methods. And then I'll give some examples from other literature and my own work to give you a sense of how mixed methods might work in practice. So Creswell and Creswell say that mixed method is an approach to inquiry. And it involves, and this is important, integrating both forms of qualitative and quantitative data. Mixed method is not, if I use different forms of qualitative data together, that's mixed method, or different forms of quantitative data together, that's mixed method. No, mixed method involves both qualitative and quantitative components. So both of them are a part of it, and we have to think about how do we integrate them. And integration starts from the design phase itself, which is as soon as we think about a research design. For example, if I'm using a quantitative research project, my research design might begin by me establishing what my sample is, how I might do my sampling, etc. Whereas within mixed methods research, we would have very distinct designs, because the philosophical assumptions themselves, the kind of theory within which we are working, will be different, because here you would have components of both the qualitative and the quantitative working together. Now, as Creswell and Creswell go on to say that this form of inquiry is important because it gives additional insight beyond the kinds of insight that we might throw by using only qualitative methods or using only quantitative methods. So there is something to bringing these methods together, to triangulating across method. However, as with anything which has its advantages, there are also limitations. And today I'll talk about both the strengths of this, as well as the things to bear in mind if we are going to use mixed method research for the work that we're doing. Now, when we start a mixed method project, as in any project, as I said, it's really useful to ask ourselves a few questions. And these questions we pose for ourselves when we are thinking about the research design. So the first question really is to ask whether my research question, or the research question we are dealing with, does mixing methods add something that individual methods wouldn't? Now, what might happen is sometimes when we have a research question, especially if we're working on a bigger project, we might have one big research question, but we might break it down into component sub-questions, which are the researchable questions, as Stanley Lieberson says. So we might have these researchable smaller questions that we're dealing with, and it's quite possible that those questions require a variety of methods rather than just one method alone. In that sense, then asking ourselves this question is really useful, because is the mixing of methods something that will happen across all my research questions? Or is it that one research question will be answered by a specific method and another research question will be answered by another one? Both of these are examples of mixed method research. We would also ask ourselves whether mixing methods is necessary for our study. Could I do this without mixing method? Could I do this by just looking at one method alone? Is there a prioritizing in my methods? Is something that we might want to ask ourselves. And then asking ourselves, what is the main aim? And this is important because our aim might be first to think about macro patterns and then to think about explanations for those patterns. So I might want to study patterns of inequality within a particular site. And I might do that macro because these are patterns and they are at the macro level. And then I might want to find explanations for why those patterns are the way they are. In that sense, then I might do my quantitative first, followed by my qualitative. However, it might also work the other way around, that I might want to understand a particular phenomena, a particular issue, or a particular field in detail first. And then I might want to, from there, design a survey instrument to figure out, whether this is also something that's applicable to other sites. So both of these are forms of mixed methods. They're both very different because in one of them, we are prioritizing in the beginning the quantitative followed by the qualitative. And in the other, we are prioritizing the qualitative followed by the quantitative. After we figured out that it's necessary and we really do want to use mixed methods and it's necessary for the project that we're doing, we ask ourselves how we'll actually analyze this data that is collected through more than one method. Now, this is not a very straightforward thing because, as you know, there are different methods for qualitative data analysis and there are different methods for quantitative data analysis. There is a very fixed kind of model-based strategy within quantitative data analysis where we pose hypotheses, we have certain data and we test those hypotheses, and it might not work exactly the same way within qualitative research. So when we are designing our project right from the beginning and thinking about mixed method as the potential thing, the potential approach that we have, it's really important to think about how would we actually analyze the data? What is the way in which we would analyze the data? And the toughest thing is what would happen if I have contradictory findings? What would happen if my qualitative research, the component of it, gives me one sort of an answer and the quantitative data gives me a different sort of an answer? How do I reconcile the two? And while, yes, it could be argued that this is something we would probably do after data is collected and analyzed and figure out that there are contradictions and then have to deal with them. Most researchers who design a mixed method study would argue that it's important to think about this in the beginning. Actually, it's important to think about this at the design phase itself to say that how will I deal with contradictions? And one way that people deal with contradictions is by actually being very open about where the differences of opinion are, where the differences of the findings are within either the qualitative or the quantitative. And finally, as in any method, we would ask ourselves, are there any specific ethical issues that we should bear in mind and that need to be kept in mind, especially since here we have more than one method that we are using. So for instance, if one does a survey, it's possible to anonymize a survey by giving codes to all the respondents, and then we don't even need to include their names in our final data set. However, while we might anonymize interviews, we might in different places have identifiable information within our interviews. So we'll have to think about how, when you're using both of these techniques together, a survey and in-depth interview, how do we ensure that ethically we are maintaining issues of confidentialities, in issues of anonymity, etc. So all of these things are important to consider right from the beginning when we start to design a mixed method project. Now, there are really three main types of mixed methods designs. And as I said, the Cresswell and Cresswell book deals with them very well. The three types are convergent mixed methods, exploratory sequential, and explanatory sequential. And the difference between the three is at what point do we use the qualitative and at what point do we use the quantitative. So the convergent mixed method is where we use both at the same time. So the convergent mixed method design is one where, as they say, we merge the qualitative and the quantitative, and we collect both forms of data at roughly about the same time. I mean, we might not do it in the same interview on the same day, but roughly over the same time period, we collect both forms of data. And the advantage of this is that as we are collecting the data, we're able to integrate it as we collect it. Now, we can imagine situations where this is quite important. For instance, if we are doing, if we have very limited time in the field, And we know that access to the field might not be something that might be granted to us for a very long period. We might want to design both the qualitative and the quantitative component to run parallelly with each other. So we might have one part of it, which is the survey, and another, which is the interviews, and we might actually do them together. And when we are, if there are, of course, any contradictions, or if there are any problems, as they mention, incongruent findings, they say, they can be further probed within the design, because I'm in the field at the same time, at roughly the same time, collecting both forms of information. I can kind of check one against the other. They mention here how both of them in the first phase, so the first phase of them includes both the qualitative and the quantitative together, and the results are merged right from the beginning, and we interpret both results and we compare them at the same time. So basically, this research is one where the qualitative and quantitative are running parallelly. We can imagine situations where this is very useful. As I said, when we might have certain access to the field, but we might still need to ask ourselves certain questions or bear some things in mind. The first of which is that if we're thinking about concepts, then we want to, because we can't go to the field and then collect a quantitative, analyze it, come back and say, oh, there was a misunderstanding in the quantitative. Now I want to understand it in detail in the qualitative. That's not possible because we're collecting both pieces of information together. So it's important to consider that concepts are designed and thought about and operationalized for the field in the beginning itself. And so we have similar concepts that we are using. It will help with the analysis, because if I have the same concept, for instance, if I'm studying social class and I have the same concept of social class in terms of how I'm operationalizing it, and I'm operationalizing it, let's say, in terms of occupation or in terms of income, then I'll make sure that in both my qualitative component and in my quantitative component, I have the same definitions of social class. I'm asking similar kinds of questions, so that I'm eliciting similar kinds of information, and the concept is, similar. This is not a priority. This is not so important in terms of concepts when we are doing it in a sequential method, as we'll see as the talk progresses, that sometimes we might not have a definition to begin with. And sometimes the field might throw up that definition, which we then want to test in a macro way. In that sense, then a sequential method may be a preferred method rather than a convergent one, where both kinds of techniques are running parallel to each other. We will, of course, in the beginning of a convergent method, want to ask ourselves about sample size. Do we have the same number of people? This is a question we have to ask. So if I'm going to use a survey, and I'm going to use an interview, do I want the same number of people in both? I might say yes, I might say no, but it's going to depend on my research question. Whether we want to weight the data, whether we're using the same people. So it could be the same number of people or the same people. They mean different things. Here we might have the same people that we do both forms of data collection from, but it's not necessary. So we would have to build that into our design. In terms of analysis, so in terms of data collection, as we saw, there's one phase only. But in terms of analysis, we would look at both the qualitative data and the quantitative data, and then together, right? So no researcher can look at everything all at the same time. So we will look at one or the other first. But the idea is that we're not prioritizing one or the other. We're not saying that there's a reason for why one first, etc. What we're doing instead is that we want to look at both of them side by side. So we might first report the qualitative or the quantitative, and then report the qualitative or the quantitative, and then discuss what is confirmed and what is not. And so the data might be transformed in the way that we kind of collect the data, because we might want to create the same database. If I'm interviewing the same people that I surveyed, I might want to create a kind of a database which has both qualitative and quantitative data components within and linked to the same individual, right, that I'm surveying and interviewing. So I might want to merge my databases. It's tough, but it's not impossible. It's actually very useful if we are able to merge them, and to display the kinds of data that we have. We might be able to display that together. essentially, we need to go beyond individual results in the discussion in our paper. We want to follow up if there's any discordance, if there's any disagreement between the qualitative and quantitative findings, and think about issues of validity. Because if we are looking at both the findings at the same time, if we have similar concepts that we were using for both forms of data, then there might be fewer issues of validity that we might have to deal with in our research design. Now, beyond convergent mixed method, we have what is called explanatory sequential mixed method. This is also from Creswell and Creswell, where they explain that the explanatory sequential is one which is preferred by those who are quantitative researchers more strongly, because the quantitative component comes first, followed by the qualitative component. So in the first phase, as you can see, you do the quantitative data collection and analysis, and in that phase is where we start to identify what we want to follow up with, followed by the qualitative data. So I'll give you one example. I might do a survey in which I'm interested in, and I'm talking about from my own fieldwork, I'm interested in women's participation in the labor market. And I might do a survey with like N number of women, let's say 100 or 200 women. I would first, analyze the data completely. Once I've collected it, I would analyze it completely. I would identify important patterns that might be emerging from my data. I will list them out and I'll say what patterns are important. And then I will say, would the qualitative research, which is through interviews or through focus group discussions or any other method that I'm using qualitatively, how can it throw light on these macro findings? So essentially, the explanatory part is the qualitative helps to explain these initial kind of quantitative findings that we might have had. And so there are, and then we might interpret the qualitative results as in how the qualitative explains the quantitative. So to repeat, we would begin this method with the quantitative first. We would first get all the findings of the quantitative. We would then pick out the key findings, and then we would analyze them qualitatively in the field, either through interviews, etc. Now, there's a huge advantage to this, which is that it gives us a macro picture. We might have a sense of the field, a very broader sense of whatever issue it is that we are studying, and we might be able to focus down, narrow down on things that giving us very specific kinds of patterns, specific kinds of outcomes, and we only focus on those. Which means that the qualitative then has a purpose, which is to throw light on the quantitative. Now, the issue here is that we have to consider sampling at two stages. Now, it's not being done in the convergent way in which sampling is happening only at one stage. We're actually doing sampling at two stages. So we would first think of the quantitative method, the sampling for the quantitative method. If it's random, for instance, in the first phase, then you might want to do again random in the second or non-random in the second. That's a possibility. The challenge here is that when we have it requires that you have a strong sense of how to analyze quantitative data, because this method requires that the quantitative be prioritized in the beginning of the study, which gives rise to these results, which are then qualitatively explained. So we want to have a grasp on the technique, the quantitative techniques. The other challenge is that which finding should I actually focus on? For anyone who does survey research, we know that any kind of analysis will throw up a lot of research, findings might actually come up. Do we want to focus on those that are outliers? Do we want to focus on the average? Do we want to focus on, the significant findings? First, we have to make that decision in the first stage of the quantitative data analysis, and only then can we actually do the qualitative part of it. It has advantages, as Creswell and Creswell themselves discuss, that it helps to see how variables might interact with each other. We can find explanations. So we can go into finding kind of explanatory reasons for why certain, patterns exist as the way they do. It can also help us because it can give rise to questions, the specific, and it helps us narrow down much more focused kinds of questions that we can ask, that we can focus for the qualitative round. Because it involves working in stages, we need to have planned out the kinds of stages that we're going to work with, which means we might not be merging our data set. In the convergent mixed method, we kind of anchor and merge the data. We can do so. In this explanatory sequential, we might not have to do it because we're using one kind of method to explain the findings of another kind of method. In the exploratory sequential, this pattern is reversed. The exploratory sequential is the one where we start with the qualitative and then we move on to the quantitative. So here, as they mentioned, we begin by first kind of getting a very broad sense of views that people might have. So I could imagine doing a focus group discussion in my first stage. Let's say I'm studying experiences at a higher educational institution, and I want to understand how people experience the classroom or classroom education. I might start by first doing either a classroom qualitative research by observing a classroom, or I might do focus group discussions with some students that might give rise to certain kinds of findings. This is very useful, this method, because it also might give rise to the idea of multiple definitions of the same concept. How people view a classroom, I might get a multivariate kind of an understanding of how that happens. And then it helps me to then design an instrument which I finally use quantitatively to test whether what I'm finding qualitatively is applicable on a quantitative and a macro stage or not. They mention how it can be important if we are going to use it to design or certain variables, design the way that a particular output is going to look like. We might do the qualitative first and then do the quantitative as a follow-up. Essentially here as well, the reverse of the explanatory sequential, the challenge is the same, which is to find out what should we be focusing on, what are the macro and what are the micro kind of subtle differences that people said in their interviews or in that we observed in the focus group discussion, which one of them should we really be focusing on for the final kind of understanding. So here as well, and they map it so well, so it's really useful to look at their text. They talk about it in terms of phases. So they say the qualitative and data collection and analysis, both are happening in the first phase. And then we start to identify things that we might want to test at the macro scale. And then we finally test it, and then we interpret our results in the final stage. So it's going to work in a reverse order from the explanatory sequential method. Here, as I said, the exploration part of it is really important because it allows us to do what sociologists do best, which is to understand what what the phenomenon might be like, to go very much into depth, to understand meaning, how people interpret their everyday lives, and then to actually apply that and see whether we see that at a bigger scale or whether we can pose causal hypotheses as related to that. We need to, of course, think about things like the way that we sample. Sampling is something we have to consider in all the different forms of a mixed method. And so here we might have a non-random sample in the first stage, followed by a random sample in the next stage. Usually here we don't, while in a explanatory sequential, you might have the same people you might do a survey with. From that subset, you might do interviews with a few of the same people. In this exploratory sequential, it need not be so. And so it's very rarely do we sample the same people, but we will sample from the same population. So if it is the university is my population, I might sample different components from the population, but I won't usually do a survey on the same people I did the focus group discussions with. As we discussed previously, we will here be analyzing the qualitative first and then moving on to the analysis of the quantitative. Now, there are, as with any other method or any other approach, there are challenges to mixed methods research. I guess the one that is the most difficult to manage is that it can take time. If imagine using one method in the field and then imagine multiplying that and thinking you're using more than one method. So it is time consuming. It also needs a lot of focus, a very strong initial focus on structure and plan. So your design needs to be very clear from the beginning. Some people, myself included, have sometimes ended up after finishing the quantitative research, realize that now I want to analyze this qualitatively, and then we build a design around that. Ideally, though, it should have been something that is thought of and planned from the beginning. So we have to think about, as I mentioned, started the talk by saying we have to think about our research questions and the intent of our study right in the beginning. What resources do I have, time and money? And will I be working in a team or will I be working alone? Because if I'm in a team, it's possible to do this at a much bigger scale. It'll be very tough to do if I'm doing it alone. And as I mentioned, for any mixed method research, because there is a quantitative component, we need to have skills for both qualitative data analysis and quantitative data analysis. So it's not just about data collection. The purpose is not just we collect the data, but also we are going to use very specific analytic techniques to analyze the qualitative data and to analyze the quantitative data. And we need to think about what happens if the plans, if they don't match. And I'll give you one example from my own work about how contradictions can come about and how do we try and resolve them. So I did a set of interviews in the beginning of a project that I was doing, and I was talking to young working women. And in that, I remember the first stage was I was asking these survey questions. And then the second stage was in-depth interviews. And so in the survey questions, I had questions like, what kind of, do you feel that in your home, I mean, I don't remember the exact wording, but in your home, what kind of work do you have to do? These are all working women. So these are women who are clearly working, but they also, take care of the home or they participate in whatever the home life is. And so I was asking them, what kinds of, do you have shared responsibilities? Do other people help you in the home? So in the survey, I remember this one person, and because it was a fairly small kind of project, I could know the quantitative and the qualitative, and I could match the two of them and kind of link the two data together. So this person said, everything is very equal in my home. My parents treat us, my brother and me, completely equally. We both work. And so there is no inequality. And I remember then doing a follow-up interview because there were some patterns that were coming out of these quantitative, which were very specific to women in the labor market. And in the qualitative interviews, I remember asking probing questions about, so when you come home, what do you do? And in that procedure, I mean, through that qualitative in-depth, I was able to find out that this person who in the survey said that there was no biasness and everything was okay, I mean, equal between her and her brother in the home. In the probing of the qualitative, was able to say that, actually, no, when I come home, I have to take care of the home. And my brother does not have to do so. I mean, there were other contradictions as well. But my issue as a researcher was, what do I say? Do I say that this person was lying in the first stage and now is telling me the truth, or vice versa? And the issue here is that neither of this is about lying or, or telling the truth. It's really about how people also respond to questions. So it tells us something about the design of different kinds of techniques. And it also tells us about how people might not view certain experiences as unequal. But when we kind of probe them further, it might come out that, yes, actually, it might not be as equal as we assumed. Now, this contradiction is something that I write about then in my work, that it might come up in one way, through one method, but it might not come up through another method. So acknowledging that there is a contradiction is a very important part of doing mixed methods research, so that we can kind of build on it and saying that there might be reasons for why we get a certain kind of finding in one using one method and a different one using a different method, and hence the richness of mixed method, which is combining the two methods allows us to do something both methods individually do not. I wanted to take one example in the last 10 minutes that I have with you and then open for questions. One of the examples, and this paper is fascinating. As I said, I'll share some readings at the end. This is a paper on the sinking of the Titanic, and it uses a mixed method research. It's a paper by Jorg et al., in which I'm not sure how clear this is, but this is one of the things that they set up as a context of their study. Now, most of us, this has been over 100 years since the sinking of the Titanic. We might not think of the Titanic as something that we use for understanding sociological phenomena, but what they do is they look at this kind of table and they find, I mean, this graph, which shows them, and this graph is divided into female passengers on the Titanic and male passengers on the Titanic. And it shows the survival rates. So it says survival on the Titanic according to gender class and type of crew. And what they find out is women had higher survival than men. And they talk about how this was probably because of the policy about women and children first on lifeboats, but also that there is a difference between women who might have been crew members and women who were not crew members, and also across class, the kinds of cabin that they were in. So women in first class passenger cabins had the highest rate of survival as compared to women who were not in, who were in third class cabins. For men, it's much sharper. And within the crew, they find that those who were on the deck, who worked on the deck, had a higher rate of survival, and those who worked inside the ship had a worse rate of survival. And those who were in the upper class men, the upper class, the kinds of cabins, they had a better rate of survival than those who didn't. So they said their thing was to try and understand sociologically what role class, occupation, and social networks. So who did you know on the boat? And so how information flows is through networks. If someone on the deck crew found out that there had been a crash and they informed somebody that they know, then that person had a higher rate of survival. So they have different hypotheses that they pose. And interestingly, drawing on their paper, they mentioned that they have two data sources that they are really tapping on. Here, they have a quantitative data set, which has over 2,000 respondents, which is included in all of this data is open source, by the way. It's in the Encyclopedia Titanica. This is about information from the rosters on who was actually on the boat, who had booked into which kind of cabin, who had which kind of job. There are questions on gender, and they also build a quantitative data set by looking at some of the interviews, and they have information of gender, social class, and all of that. Their second data set, they said, comes from survivor testimonies. So those who actually survived the sinking of the Titanic, as well as those who were involved in the trial proceedings that followed the sinking of the Titanic, because both the British and American, governments had trials, legal trials about why this ship sank. And they mentioned very interestingly that the testimonies take different forms. So they have interviews of journalists, they have trial proceedings, they have journalist accounts of the survivors, they have letters that people might have written to their families, they have affidavits, so all of this data is collected at very different times. So it's a very rich way to kind of bring together different forms of data within the same kind of, the method that they're using. And they say that while there are possibilities of bias, and I only highlight this part of their papers so that we can understand how bias is, of course, going to be there, but how triangulating, how mixing methods allows us to overcome that bias. They mentioned that there is an advantage to mixed method. There have been many published studies, by the way, if anybody wants to search on them, especially quantitative studies on the sinking of the Titanic. This is probably one of the first few studies, which is a mixed method study, looking sociologically at factors that influenced survival. And so they say that there are certain advantages of mixed method. And one of them is that because the qualitative data set is nested within the quantitative, so the quantitative is much bigger and the testimonies are fewer, they can consider things like sample selection bias. They have information already on gender, the class, the cabin, the crew, etc. Further, they say that because they have qualitative records, they actually have a possibility to triangulate across different kinds of qualitative information. As I mentioned on the previous slide, they mentioned that they have information from survivors themselves, letters they wrote, testimonies. Triangulating across these different kinds of methods allows them to get a much better sense of what might have been happening on that ship when that ship was sinking. And also they talk about how allowing to look at both this macro and the nested micro data helps them to cross-check the results that they are getting from the different methods that they're using. The second example that I want to use, so the first one was on the Titanic, and this is the last thing I'll talk about, is from my own work on the study of social mobility. Social mobility it's a very broad topic, and it's important if you're thinking about studying social change and inequality across strata. And we know that mobility, there are certain government policies that help to encourage social mobility. However, we also know that barriers exist to mobility. Now, in sociology, there are several approaches. So you have quantitative approaches to the study of social mobility. Income and wealth is what economists mostly use. In sociology, we use occupation-based approaches. Qualitatively, people have done ethnographies in this field. People have done life histories as a part of their ethnography in the field. And so you have a variety of methods people have used, but very rarely have they combined the two. So I was interested to see how the patterns that we get, what kinds of results come out of that. And so I was interested in questions about, first to begin with, how are mobility patterns differently, how you see them differently according to gender, caste, location, religion, etc. And then what are the drivers of mobility? For instance, is education a driver of mobility? And then finally, how do people experience mobility? Now, for the first two, since they involve causal mechanisms and they involved macro patterns, the quantitative approach was the one that I prioritized. And for the second one, for the third question, it was the qualitative. But I was able to use the results from my quantitative data, which basically was, because it's a sequential pattern, the results I got were from a national level study on social mobility patterns by gender and locality. I was able to isolate the urban patterns and look at what the urban patterns were. I then went into the field and was able to do a survey in two sites, Delhi and Patna. But I did a follow-up only in Delhi of in-depth interviews with working women, and finally case studies. So I could do this in a sequential way, each of these methods helping me to answer certain questions that were arising from the previous method, to throw some light on some findings from the previous method. So I found that a very useful thing. That was one thing. And more recently, I used another kind of a mixed method design, and not very, in my own words, not the best kind of mixed method design, but given the limitation of macro data, I had to work around the data that exists. It's a recent paper that I wrote on gender and work, and ambition, satisfaction, and work, in which I first started with the World Value Survey and the National Election Survey data. But the World Value Survey is a cross-nationally comparative one. National Election Survey is a nationally representative one. And then after the results of that, I was able to look at my qualitative interviews and the case studies that I've done in light of the macro findings. However, these two data sets are not merged because they don't belong to the same sample, right? So I was trying to throw light on the role of ambition and satisfaction by looking at what it looks like at the macro level for questions around economic satisfaction and satisfaction that people might have in their everyday life. These questions exist in the World Value Survey, they exist in the National Election Survey, and then through the interviews that I had done qualitatively to think about how women spoke about what spurs them to work. Is failure one of the ways that you might actually be you might give up because of failure, or you might be pushed to work even harder because of failure? So what motivates women? How does ambition work around? So this allowed me to basically look at both the qualitative and the quantitative data together. So in the end, all I want to say, because I have 1 minute remaining till we can open for questions. I thought 45 minutes was a good time, and then we can take any Q&A, is to just kind of recap what I've said. A mixed method design is one where, or mixed method project is one where the mixing of methods starts from the design phase itself. So we start at the first stage, trying to think about what purpose would each of these individual methods serve, and what purpose would these methods serve if they were kind of triangulated together, put together. In that, we saw that we can do them in 3 different ways. We can do both methods at the same time, so converging them, or we can do them sequentially, either qualitative first or the quantitative first. And all 3 of them are driven by the kind of research question we are asking. So for me, I've predominantly used the explanatory sequential because the research questions that I prioritized was the macro patterns and then the explanation of those patterns. So for instance, I found through my macro research that women in urban India display very different patterns of intergenerational social class mobility as compared to men. They are much more socially mobile as compared to men, both upward and downward. Now that is my bigger macro patterns. That pushed me to do qualitative research, to talk to women, to ask them how they actually negotiated the workspace, the role education played in them, and how they viewed social mobility or stability or downward mobility versus upward mobility. Finally, these are some readings that I would suggest, and I'm happy to also share these with the organizers if needed. The first is the book that I drew on for because it's a textbook, it's really unparalleled in the sense it gives a very clear sense of all three kinds of methods: qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and mixed methods. I was drawing on chapter 10, which is really on mixed methods approaches. There are a couple of papers that I recommend strongly, which are one of these, which is about how do you do mixed methods, so how it works in action, is the JIC paper. And then there are this paper by Johnson et al., which is really about how, especially in the light of educational research, how mixed methods is a kind of paradigm where, this is the time to think about it, and they have components of how you might do mixed methods. The paper on the Titanic is this one by Stoltz et al. This is an excellent sociological paper on how we find sociological explanations for certain phenomena, and mixing methods, how it allows us to throw light on this phenomena. For instance, survival from the sinking of the Titanic. And the final is a paper, the recent paper that I wrote. The last thing that I'd like to say is that there are different softwares that are available for those who might be interested in doing mixed method research. As you know, and maybe you've had sessions on software programs, qualitative data analysis has very specific software programs. For instance, one of them is MaxQDA. MaxQDA is very powerful. It allows you to feed in your qualitative data. So that could be interviews, it could be archives, it could be newspapers, it could be anything, your qualitative information. And it has scope for you to do your own coding, either axial or nested, whatever form of qualitative coding you're using, and then it allows you to analyze the data. Quantitatively, there are different software programs, for instance, SPSS, Data, etc., that do the quantitative data analysis. Mixing them both, this paper, for instance, of the Titanic, uses the MaxQDA as a form to actually draw out, because they have codes on survival, etc., how they draw it out. They also have a paper online, these same authors, talking about this data analytic program, the MaxQDA, and how they use it for their analysis. So we're now in a situation where there are a lot of softwares available, and I think knowing how to harness them is a very powerful and useful thing. And so I hope you found this talk to be useful. I'll now stop sharing my slides, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It's always wonderful listening to you. Ma'am, we have a few questions in the chat box. Probably you can have a look at it and kindly check the ones that you want to answer.
Yes, sure. So I'll just start from the beginning. Dr. Mayuk says, while using mixed method, does the sample need to be different or same? As I mentioned, I think I hope it became clearer during the talk that the sample is going to vary depending on which kind of mixed method technique you are prioritizing. So if you're using a convergent mixed method, you might be using a similar sample, but it might not be the same case for an exploratory sequential, for instance. So it's going to depend on the kind of approach that you're actually using. How do you manage the common method bias? I mean, there are biases. So the strength of mixed method research is it's allowing us to tap into the advantages of both kinds of methods. The limitation is that, of course, you have limitations of both kinds of methods. And so to deal with bias, as I mentioned, you might want to design that right from the beginning if we are able to imagine what might happen in the field, but sometimes we are not able to imagine that. In that case, we would deal with bias as we do in any other data analysis, which is at the quantitative phase, dealing with the kinds of biases that might come up, writing about them, and then doing the same in the qualitative phase. Pooja says, how can we define the samples? I think it's the same. If we are conducting in-depth interviews, then how can we say that 6 interviews are enough? How do we define the numbers? Yeah, so you've had, I'm sure, sessions on sample size and whether there is a certain number. The students, especially that I've worked with, seem to think that saying round numbers like 10, 20, 30, 40 sounds good. There's really no reason for that. In quantitative research, there are procedures for determining sample size, and those procedures are based on your the universe and the margin of error that you're willing to gather. There will be software programs online that allow you to calculate your quantitative sample size if you're going to use a random sample technique. Qualitatively, there is no such thing that there is a minimum amount. Usually we need to have, once you have data saturation, which is when you start to get results which are potentially repetitive, or they are repeating similar kinds of patterns, we might feel that we have some sort of data saturation. However, this is going to be driven entirely by the purpose of your study. So it's not necessary that the more the people I have, the better my data. Some people argue that if I have a larger sample size, I'm able to, somehow that makes my research better. Actually, it doesn't. What makes, for instance, a quantitative research more applicable is not the sample size, but the sample technique. Was it random or non-random? If it's random sampling, then even a small sample, you can actually generalize to a population. If it's non-random, you could do 1,000 survey and it won't make a difference because it's non-random. It's not representative by definition of the population. So look at the technique itself. Look at whether the sampling technique varies. Think about whether you can do random sampling or non-random sampling. And then these issues of how many you should have would potentially kind of build, will kind of come through with it. Study with, I've checked the studies. I'll share the articles. Can we use numerical data and qualitative research? How do we distinguish it from mixed method, right? I mean, you can use numerical data in qualitative research. For example, if you've done interviews, you could code them and you could quantify them. If you are going to, the mixed method is when the data at its root is quantitative in nature. So you're talking about things which are measurable and you're comparing those. Most surveys that sociologists use are actually qualitative data that's quantified. So surveys will ask questions like, what is your opinion about this particular policy? And then there will be options 1, 2, 3, 4. Opinion is a qualitative, it's qualitative, but we are basically using we are quantifying the codes that we are giving it. So we do something similar with qualitative research as well. One example of this is interesting is and the ethnography includes participant observation, it includes in-depth interviews, and now they're saying, can they do surveys with an ethnography and will that make it mixed methods? Actually, that's not mixed method because ethnography itself is an approach, right? Ethnography is not one method, it's a basket of methods that come together in a particular kind of approach. So you have Malinowski, who was also doing surveys, household surveys or village surveys, and we've had people do those for a long period of time. So it's really about the approach that you're using, about how that data is going to be analyzed. And if it's an ethnography, then from the beginning, your approach is an ethnographic approach. It's not a mixed method approach. It is an ethnographic approach, which by definition might include, mixing of methods. Could you suggest some studies which employ the 3 types of method that you go through? I gave you some examples from it. How do you report the measures mainly for explanatory? Okay, how do you report? This is interesting, but a question by Barsha. How do you report the findings? Do you first report one and then the other? It's really up to you. If you're doing it in a sequential way, you probably would report the first analysis and then what led you to pose let's say if it's the quantitative first, you've done that and you've analyzed it, you might then report the qualitative. However, I've seen projects that report them concurrently. They actually, they'll do the study in stages, but the reporting of it is overall in light of the research question. So in that, they'll draw on both the qualitative and the quantitative together. So it's really up to you how you might report it. It's not that you have to report them in sequence and then analyze all of them. But if you're writing a thesis, potentially that is how you would do it. But even, it depends also on like the way that you're posing the question that you're posing. It's transformed into measurable variables. Okay, in terms of how qualitative themes be transformed into measurable variables for quantitative phases, as I said, that's routinely done. We routinely ask questions that might be qualitative in nature and we quantify them by coding. right? And coding, I'm not sure if the organizers are here, if you're having any session on coding and analyzing qualitative data. If you are, then that session will probably take care of this. If you're not, please read up a little about coding. I'll give you, there's a book, I'm typing the name of the book, has chapters on both. It's a very basic textbook on research methods, but it has chapters on both qualitative and quantitative data analysis. I think this is the name of the book. I'm not sure. It's the name of the author is absolutely correct. If you can search for Earl Babby, and he has two chapters, one on qualitative data analysis, one on quantitative data analysis, in which there's also a discussion on codes and how you might code different kinds of data. I might have lost my way. Where was I? Because I started typing. 1 second. Okay. Could you explain why it's not advised to collect data from the same sample set in the exploratory sequential? Because you've probably already got all of this information. See, there is also a potential for bias when people already know what you might be asking them in the quantitative phase. In the qualitative phase, they're already giving you a very in-depth kind of an understanding on it. And in the quantitative phase, if you go back to the same people, they already have a sense of what you might be asking. It's usually not advised, but people might have done it. I'm genuinely not sure if you use it. Usually, though, I don't think you use the same sample in both of them. How can qualitative into measurable? Okay. Okay. When mixing methods, are there any framework about sampling size when we're doing it simultaneously? I think sample size is dependent on the method and the purpose of the study. Sample size is also dependent on your sampling frame. So if you have an adequate sampling frame which exists, then you can work with a random sample, and the sampling size, as I said, you use one of the calculators online. There are, if you Google them, there are sample size calculators. You give them the kind of margin of error that you're willing to live with, to do your analysis within, and you give them your sample frame. So the total population, it'll calculate the sample size for you. It doesn't do that with qualitative research because we have a different purpose. And so if it's non-random, then you don't use the sample size calculators. So there is no one framework about how there should be a sample. It's going to depend on the study itself. I think I mentioned how contradictions might be handled. Usually they're handled by mentioning what the contradiction is and potentially why the contradiction actually occurred. For me, I think one of the reasons for why the contradiction occurred is how questions might be asked in one method, in one technique, might be very different from how they're asked in another technique. And so one of them might be more amenable, especially when we're doing interviews over a period of time, where the same people might be amenable to very different forms of information. And so writing about potentially where that contradiction lies. If you do find a contradiction, please don't like push it under the carpet because you feel that actually tells us something that is wrong with my study. It might actually be telling you something that you did right in the study, which is the reason you did mixed method, is that the one method wasn't sufficient. You needed the other method to try and understand what was happening. And so to write about the contradictions and acknowledge them is important. Okay, determining. Do we take the same sample molecule is that the quantitative? It'll depend on which. If you're doing an explanatory sequential, you might do so. This is Debahuti Gogoi's question, which is whether you take the same sample from the for the qualitative as from the quantitative. You can do so. In the study that I mentioned to you, in which I was looking at a macro data and then doing interviews, I couldn't use the same sample because the first study was using a existing secondary data source, and the second one was my own primary data source. Can we use separate data collection fields for collecting? To take the same field. Yeah, if you have a rationale for why you have different fields, then you might be able to, but I would need to know why you then used a different method in the two fields. Why wouldn't you use the two methods. This is Nithika. Why wouldn't you use the two methods in both the fields? So there needs to be a really good reason for why you do so. I'm not sure that this really would help you to do a mixed method if in one field site you're doing one thing and another. But if you have, like as I did, if you have one which is a particular kind of macro data and one which is a data you're collecting, that might work because the sites might not necessarily be the same, but the bigger kind of population is the same. It's looking at the urban population, for example. All right. I think that's it. And someone's already shared the book. See, this is how wonderful these online courses are. So you already have the book. So thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you. That was an amazing session, and we would love to have you again, actually. And to all the participants, thank you so much for being with us throughout the day. And we shall start tomorrow at 10 again. Thank you so much. We will end today's workshop here.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
ma'am.